What up, though? Heroes of American History, Ponce de Leon. Juan Ponce de Leon. I guess that's a picture of him. I don't know how accurate it is, but it's what we have. Juan Ponce de Leon by Frederick A. Ober, Heroes of American History, 1908. The writer has been compelled to pursue his subject through several works, historical in nature, dealing with the times in which he lived, but affording scant material for a biography. The author's researchers in the West Indies were not unfruitful, for he has visited both Santo Domingo and Puerto Rico several times, as well as investigated in Guadalupe and other islands of the Lesser Antilles. Of all the Spanish writers, Barcia is the fullest in details respecting Ponce de Leon. His work entitled Ensayo Cronológico para la Historia General de la Florida. It was put forth as from the pen of Don Gabriel de Cardenas, though really written by Don Andres Gonzalez Barcia and published in Madrid, 1723. Barcia based his narratives referring to De Leon upon material found in the history by Herrera, who he says had access to the letters which Juan Ponce wrote to the Emperor Charles V, Cardinal Adrian, and others. All the sources on Ponce de Leon are mentioned in Winsor's Narrative and Critical History, and to them the reader is respectfully referred, with the caution, however, to be prepared for a long and perhaps wearisome search. Some of you have seen the Ponce de Leon as on one of the street names in the town you live in. I have Juan Ponce de Leon, the Valiant Exemplar, 1443 through 1482. The Ponces de Leon, Juan, and Rodrigo, noteworthy names of a family famed in the annals of America and Spain. Of the two, doubtless the latter was the more distinguished in the land of his birth for bravery and military skill, but the former achieved a still wider celebrity by linking his name with the discovery of Florida and the search for the fountain of youth. These two famous sons of Spain were not closely related, although they bore the same patronymic, as Juan came from an ancient family of Aragon, and Rodrigo from an equally ancient and in the 15th century more flourishing house of Andalusia, or the south of Spain. Both belonged to the Hidalguia, or Spanish nobility. Soldiers were they both, trained almost from infancy in the profession of arms, but while Juan was still a page at the court of Pedro Núñez de Guzman, Señor of Toro, Rodrigo could raise an army of his own retainers and vassals, for he was then the most illustrious of the Ponces, and having in youth come into the ownership of title and estates, was well and widely known as the powerful Marquis of Cadiz. As his territory at the time this story opens lay contiguous to the region then occupied by the Moors, with whom for centuries the Spaniards had been engaged in deadly warfare. He had been, as it were, cradled beneath the canopies of tents, nurtured upon the traditions of his ancestors, and matured with Spain's seasoned veterans in the field. Thus, it came to pass that he was regarded by the king and the queen, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, as their most doughty champion, defender of the faith, and the implacable antagonist of the Mahometan Moors. I know most of you have heard of Moors, and you associate Moors with black. But here it says Mahometan Moors, and Spain was engaged in disputes with the Moors for hundreds of years, I guess. And the Moors are Mahometan Muslims from northern Africa. For more than 7 centuries, the Moors from Africa had held possession of some portion of the Iberian Peninsula, but at the period in which Juan and Rodrigo Ponce de Leon appeared upon the scene, they were restricted to a mountainous region bordering upon the Mediterranean Sea. Ponce de Leon is said to have discovered Florida, and I think that's disrespectful. Well, discovered means to see, but his name is often associated with Florida, and he is a champion of those who see him as the discoverer of Florida, the beginning of their people in Florida. But I would say, is disrespectful to the indigenous people of Florida, and you know who you are. 1,000 years ago, indeed, the Mahometans, I'm assuming that has something to do with Muhammad, had taken as their own the best part of Spain. They had even crossed the French frontier and threatened to invade all Europe. Turned about by the blows of Charles Martel in that fierce battle of the year 732, the Saracens began their century-long retreat southward, but near 500 years elapsed before their power was shattered on the field of Tolosa. Many of us have no idea who Ponce de Leon is. We are getting to know Juan Ponce of Leon. After that, the Spaniards gathered courage to attack the Moors at every opportunity. Still, it was not till the end of the 15th century that they were practically driven from Spain. The refluent wave to Africa was a very long time in reaching its shores. And for those of you who call yourselves Moors, just understand what you are calling yourself. Again, Mahometan Africans, Mahometan Moors, North Africans. Maybe you are North African. Have you looked? Isabella and Ferdinand, by their union, they welded together the chain of little kingdoms of Spanish provinces that stretched across the peninsula from the Mediterranean to Portugal's frontier. We are speaking of real Spanish people. We're not speaking of complexions right now. We don't know their complexion, and as far as I'm concerned, it's not important. When you see someone who speaks Spanish, okay, we are speaking of the Spaniards. Behind the retreating Moors and Spaniards erected impregnable barriers. One year they took and refortified a city, another a province, a mountain range, a river and its banks. But whatever was taken, they held. Broader and broader became the region that lay north of the Moors, from which they were banished forever. The Moors were still numerous in that portion of Spain to which the exigencies of war had driven their ancestors. They were yet fierce and warlike, and now and again, like hawks swooping from their eyries, they descended from their mountain valleys and ravished Christian territory. But they could make no head against the encroachments of the Spaniards, and were fortunate if they could hold what they had. The towns and villages embosomed within rock-walled valleys, cities like Loja, and Grenada, similar to Grenada in the Caribbean. You see where it comes from. Most of these things are Spanish. If you learn who your people are by tracing their roots, tracing your family bloodlines through records and things of that nature, speaking with the older members of your families, I'm pretty sure they called themselves and they called that place in the Caribbean something other than Grenada, maybe. With beautiful mosques and teeming marketplaces, castles like Alhambra, with its impregnable fortifications girdling the hill of the sun that towered above the city of the faithful in Spain. It's funny how I'm speaking of Spain right now, and one would wonder, why would Spain have anything to do with America? Me being an American, the only American it ever was, is, and will be, well, it seems as though people come to our soil to fight each other. Within the Alhambra, at the opening of the year 1580, dwelt the powerful Moorish sovereign Muley ibn Hassan, who had succeeded to the throne in 1465. Grenada was his capital and glorious Alhambra his palace of delights, while his sway ended over 60 fortified cities and towns. Still, he was expected by the Christian sovereigns to pay them annual tribute, to pay them taxes. He had not paid it then these many years, but only a few months before King Ferdinand had sent an embassy with a demand for the tribute, for the taxes. Yeah, they taxing them money and captives, which was customary in the time of Muley's father, Ishmael. The embassy was received with courtesy and sumptuously entertained in the palace of the Alhambra. But when Muley Hassan heard the message, he is said to have returned the haughty answer: the kings of Grenada, who used to pay tribute, who used to pay taxes to the Castilians, are dead. Tell your sovereigns, our mints coin, now nothing but lance heads and scimitar blades, but these are at their service. An armed truce had existed for years between the Spaniards and the Moors, but as was perfectly apparent to both Mohammedans and Christians, a crucial conflict in the very near future was inevitable. The insolent reply of the Moorish king rendered it so, even if existing conditions had not. But at the time, King Ferdinand was unable to proceed against his mortal enemy, owing to a war with Portugal and dissensions in his kingdom. Taking advantage of King Ferdinand's preoccupation in Portugal, the wily Muley Hassan suddenly descended upon Zahara, a Spanish post on his western frontier. One stormy winter's night in Christmas week of 1481, a band of Moorish soldiery scaled the battlements and fell upon the unsuspecting garrison as if from the clouds. The long period of peace had rendered the Spaniards negligent, and the fierce tempest had driven the sentinels to shelter, so that the Moors took them entirely by surprise. Now, while the king believed in fighting fire with fire, as the Spanish proverb has it, quenching one fire with another, he was not then in position to act. He was laying his plans for an invasion of Moorish territory on such a scale that once undertaken, not merely detached outposts should be reduced, but eventually the entire kingdom. His dukedom comprised vast possessions in Andalusia, contiguous to the Moorish provinces. And in his service, he held many converted Moors as scouts, or adalides, who spied upon the movements of their countrymen and reported to their master what was going on. He held many of the converted Moors as scouts, similar to how the Seminole Scouts were recruited by the U.S., or as some would say, by their enemy against their own. Then Rodrigo Ponce de Leon, Marquis of Cadiz, collected 3,000 cavalry and 4,000 infantry, nearly all his own retainers, and on a day in February 1482 set out for Alhama. We have to, at some point, it would probably be in your best interest to kind of look up some of the sources that this author used, because I'm always curious as to how they know specific dates. And I know they took records, but it wouldn't hurt to see where they got these records from. All were brave men without fear of death, but the Marquis would not needlessly expose them. So, although they could then see the towns and fortress from their hiding places in the Sierra, he waited till the shades of night had fallen. As the Moorish soldiers came forth, they were slaughtered without mercy, and soon the uproar within reached the army, without which joined in with loud shouts and the din of kettle drum and trumpet. After the walls were gained, the Moors fought desperately for the rooftops, thresholds, and hearthstones, for they knew no mercy would be shown them, and that all survivors, women and children, as well as men, would be carried away as captives and immured in dungeons or sold as slaves. They were finally overcome. Vast booty was obtained, consisting of gold and silver, cattle, horses, silks, grains, and honey. For Alhama was called the richest town in Muley Hassan's kingdom and was a repository for rents and tribute money, rents and tax money. The Marquis had no intention of losing his hold on this erstwhile stronghold of the Moors. Nay, nay, he said, God hath given the place into our hands. God is always giving these people something. That's why you have to know who is God. Another army was being raised under the direct command of the king, and information of this coming to the ears of Muley Hassan, he exerted himself to the utmost to carry the castle by storm before the reinforcements should arrive. His escaladors mounted the walls by hundreds, only to be thrown headlong back into the ravines, but by the means of a secret passage, some 70 fierce Africans gained access to the citadel before they were discovered and attacked by the garrison. And as we see, Moors are synonymous with Africans in this literary selection that we have here. A most desperate engagement ensued, but the Moors were finally overwhelmed by superior numbers and the last Moslem cut down. The banner of the Prophet, which they had defended so valiantly, was then displayed from the ramparts, while 70 turbaned heads were thrown over the walls to dismay the besiegers. At sight of the captured banner and the dissevered heads, Muley Hassan went wild with rage, but he was unable then to avenge his valiant followers, for close up him now were pressing the forces of Medina Sidonia. Compelled to retreat back to Grenada, he hastened, and into the castle poured Don Rodrigo's rescuers, ere the last Moorish banner had disappeared behind the hills. Thus Alhama, which was won by Rodrigo Ponce de Leon and rescued by his lifelong foe, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, continued in Spanish possession and has ever since remained. In this destructive war to death, which was prolonged through 10 years of almost incessant fighting, the Marquis of Cadiz, Rodrigo Ponce de Leon, bore a most important part from its beginning to its ending in 1492. He was one of the cavaliers, so this is what's happening in 1492, as well as the discovery of a portion of the Americas by Columbus. It is said he was one of the cavaliers selected by King Ferdinand to act as sponsors to his son, Prince Juan, when he began his career of arms and received the dignity of knighthood on the field of war beneath the walls of Grenada. He was also one of the principal nobles who accompanied the king in the last campaign against the Moors of Grenada. When, with an army 50,000 strong, in the month of April 1491, he began the siege, which was not to end until the last Moslem had capitulated. It was in January 1492 that the Marquis of Cadiz entered the glorious Alhambra Palace in the train of Ferdinand and Isabella and participated in the ceremonies that attended their re-enthronement in the famed Hall of Justice. He may have been there when, a little later, in the same palace, in the same place, they signed the capitulation with Columbus for the voyage that resulted in the discovery of America, of your home land. Ponce de Leon in America, 1493 to 1502. Rodrigo Ponce de Leon, Marquis of Cadiz, the foremost Spanish champion in the Moorish Wars, passed away 7 months after the surrender of Grenada, and in that very month of August 1492, which witnessed the sailing of Christopher Columbus for the New World. Long before he closed his eyes to earthly scenes, he had achieved a reputation for surpassing that of any other Ponce de Leon. Ponce of Leon, but another of the name was soon in the field, who was to perpetuate his most heroic exploits, though in a land far distant over the ocean. Juan Ponce de Leon, who, needless to say, perhaps is the actual subject of this biography, was also engaged in the wars against the Moors of Grenada, but in a humbler capacity than his illustrious exemplar. He was born at San Servos, province of Campos, Spain, in 1560, and was thus 17 years the junior of Rodrigo Ponce, as well as his inferior in rank. It might be a pleasure to know and be able to say that young Juan Ponce of Leon was a great favorite with King Ferdinand and his consort, that he everywhere followed his title namesake into the thickest of the fray, that he bearded the Moslem warriors in their strongholds, and that he finally retired to his estates with vast spoil obtained from the infidels. In order to account for him after the siege, some of the older historians have him sail with Columbus on his voyage of 1493, and this is far from improbable, though there exists no proof. The author of the Historia de Florida, published in 1723, says, quoting Oviedo's, Ponce de Leon was one of the original conquistadors of Hispaniola, having gone there with Don Christopher Columbus in 1493 as a captain of infantry. Richard Eaton, the English translator of Peter Martyr's De Cales, in the latter half of the 16th century, quaintly says, this John Ponce had before sailed with Christopher Colon to the island of Hispaniola in the year 1493. He was a gentler soldier in the wars of this island and captain of the province of Higuel for Nicolas de Ovando that conquested the same. He was 32 years of age when Grenada surrendered. He was 42 when Ovando, with whom he served, embarked for the West Indies, and 52 when he went in search of the mythical Fountain of Youth, your homeland. They saw your homeland as the Fountain of Youth. They were looking for the Fountain of Youth, it is said. Of course, there was more to the story than just looking for the Fountain of Youth. And we can take that looking, searching for the Fountain of Youth in many different ways. Again, after his vain search for the Fountain of Youth, he remained an old man, says this, and we consider these people to be intelligent people. To be honest with you, he had it right. He found the Fountain of Youth. It's just that it wasn't the soil portion that he sprouted up from. And again, your soil portion needs you just as much as you need it. It is the Fountain of Youth for the American Indians. Okay? But it is not the fountain of youth for a foreigner. The fountain of youth for a foreigner lies within the soil that they sprout from. I would have thought they would have known this. But see, that wasn't their only motive. Again, after his vain search for the fountain of youth, he remained an old man, says the same writer. Yet he was then only 53 and scarce 62 when an Indian arrow terminated his career. So he got popped. Nicolas de Ovando, who was dispatched to Hispaniola by King Ferdinand to supersede Francisco de Bobadilla, the man who won unenviable distinction by sending the Columbus brothers home to Spain in chains, was a person whom a monarch might trust, but an ordinary man of affairs would not. He was shiesty. Unused to labor of any kind, they promptly abandoned the mines. Unused to labor of any kind, they promptly abandoned the mines when they found that gold could only be obtained by toilful digging. And it was not long before the roads and trails leading to Santo Domingo were again thronged with these same despairing cavaliers who, having exhausted their resources, besought Ovando to send them back to Spain, send us home. Send us to the crib. Send us to the flat. You understand? It's too much work. That would have been, and it's too hot. Ain't no air conditioning. It's too hot. And we got all these clothes on, man. We got on 6-piece suits, ruffles, tights. That would have been the wisest course to pursue. For the island was already overpopulated with worthless Spaniards of the non-producing class. It was already overpopulated with worthless Spaniards of the non-producing class, but the governor induced them to remain by bestowing extensive grants of land, along with which went large numbers of Indians as slaves. Now, Ovando had been expressly forbidden by Isabella and Ferdinand to continue this system of repartimientos, as the wholesale distribution of the natives in this manner was termed. Wholesale distribution of natives is called the system of repartimientos. The distribution of the natives of Hispaniola, of the islands, the Americans, the Indians. In fact, he had been commanded to abolish it, and of course, it's more specifically what your family called themselves, what your people called themselves, and what they called you. In fact, he had been commanded to abolish it throughout the island, but finding that the Indians would not work unless compelled, he had not carried out the wishes of the sovereigns. They would only work they wouldn't work unless compelled, unless forced. Instead, he had represented to them that the natives not only refused to labor when released from their obligation to do so, but lapsed into paganism to the great detriment of their morals. This hypocritical plea had its effect upon Isabella, who ordered the Indians under restraint again, but recommended that they should be paid for their labor and treated humanely. They should be made to be employees. You see, Isabella wanted to send them some job applications. She said, well, if we can't make them, if we can't force them, let's tell them, we got some job openings and see if they need a job and see if they want to get paid. Now, mind you, these people were fine being left alone. The word humanity was not in the Spaniards' vocabulary. And yet, there's so many people today that have great pride in being called Spanish, because they speak Spanish, and this is why they speak Spanish. The word humanity was not in the Spaniards' vocabulary, and it could hardly be expected that the fiendish Ovando would have use for it. He had in effect the sovereign's authority for re-enslaving the Indians, and promptly availed himself of it to bestow upon his friends all the natives he could capture by the use of dogs and savage soldiery. Dogs. And when we say dogs, we're not talking about chihuahuas, okay? We're not talking about the chihuahua. We talking about Spanish mastiffs. Y'all ever seen a Spanish mastiff? Look up Spanish mastiff and savage soldiery. Soon there was no portion of the island exempt from ravage. No body of Indians that was not forced to labor for the Spaniards. Now, mind you, every community of Indians didn't have 100 family members. Some just had a single family, and they were ravaged by Spanish mastiffs, dogs, and savage soldiery. Under cover of this hired labor, says the voracious historian Mr. Irving, more intolerable toil was exacted from them, and more horrible cruelties were inflicted than in the worst days of Bobadilla. They were often separated the distance of several days' journey from their wives and children. These are the Indians. The Indians were often the Indians of the Caribbean, of the islands, your family members. They were often separated the distance of several days' journey from their wives and children, and doomed to intolerable labor of all kinds, extorted by the cruel infliction of the lash. For food, and cruel infliction of the lash, and you were taught that millions and millions and trillions of Africans, remember those Africans, the Moorish, Mohammedan Moors, the Africans, remember them? They just went to war or was fighting with the Spaniards for a long time. Made you think that those were the people who they was over here in the cotton fields and and getting whipped. Well, here we're speaking of Indians from the Caribbean islands, from the Americas, being extorted by the cruel infliction of the lash. For food, they had only cassava bread and unsubstantial support for men obliged to labor, and so little of that when the Spaniards who superintended the mines were at their repast, says Las Casas, the famished Indians scrambled under the table like dogs for any bone thrown to them. While the Spaniards thus withheld the nourishment necessary to sustain their health and strength, they exacted a degree of labor sufficient to break down the most vigorous man. If the Indians fled from this incessant toil and took refuge in the mountains, they were hunted out like wild beasts, scourged in the most inhumane manner, and laden with chains to prevent a second escape. It must be remembered that this report of Spanish cruelty was not made on hearsay, but came from an eyewitness, Bishop Las Casas, who continues, I have found many an Indian dead in the road, others gasping under the trees, and others in the pangs of death, faintly crying, hunger, hunger. Those who reached their homes most commonly found them desolate, for during the 8 months they had been absent, their wives and children had either perished or wandered away. The fields on which they depended for food were overrun with weeds, and nothing was left them but to lie down exhausted and despairing and die at the thresholds of their habitations. This sounds like the story of what we term as North America, or, southeastern states, southeastern, cotton country, tobacco country. This sounds like the story of that we were sold, right? This sound like the story that we was sold. And it's happening in Hispaniola, in the Caribbean, in the Americas, in the islands. To these people, the Spanish cruelties was not made on hearsay, but came from an eyewitness. Such was the sway of Don Nicolas de Ovando in Hispaniola. Under his rule, the natives dwindled. The Americans, the Indians, dwindled steadily. At his orders, they were enslaved, beaten into submission, driven into the grave by hundreds and by thousands. But worse was yet in store for these unfortunate Indians of Hispaniola. Hispaniola. Is Hispaniola Haiti, the Dominican Republic today? They were to be hounded to the verge of extermination by this same Ovando, who, as soon as he was firmly seated as governor, began the process of dissemination, or decimation, I should say. Casting about for some defenseless natives upon whom he might actively exercise his powers for evil, he found that a tribe existed in the western part of the island, which had not been completely subjugated, that is, had not been wholly brought under the system of repartimientos, slavery. It was ruled by a once beautiful caciquess, by a beautiful female chief, the sister of a cacique, the sister of a chief known as Behiccio, whose name was Anacona. Her name was Anacona, the once beautiful chief, the once beautiful chiefess. Okay? They're talking about the western part of the island, which was ruled by a beautiful chief, a beautiful sister. And she was the sister of a chief. His name was Behiccio, and her name was Anacona. She had been a friend of the most noble brother of Christopher Columbus, Don Bartholomew, and this alone was sufficient to make her the victim of Ovando's malevolence. Her beautiful daughter, Higuenamata, had been beloved by a Spanish cavalier, one Hernando de Guevara, who on this account had been persecuted by Christopher Columbus at the instigation of the rebel Rodin. The last named, after declaring against the rule of Columbus several years previous to the arrival of Ovando, had finally come to the terms with him and afterwards sought a retreat in Anacona's province, where he and his companions in iniquity perpetuated every species of crime that their depraved natures could suggest. It may be imagined what treatment the caciquess Anacona received. The beautiful chief, the beautiful sister Anacona received. What treatment she received. Don't get too deep in your imagination. You know what they did to her. Think about this. These are Spaniards, okay? And we not talking complexions. We not talking complexions. You don't know their complexion. Some of them look like you. These were men who was used to taking shit, right? Taking everything, including Anacona, and anything she held as sacred to her. You don't even want to imagine what they did to this sister. And as to her daughter's fate, history is silent, though tradition states it was worse than death itself. Ovando gathered together 370 soldiers, infantry, and cavalry and marched directly for Zaragua, which was the seat of Anacona's authority. To the unsuspecting caciques, to the unsuspecting chiefess, he sent word that he was coming on a friendly visit, and Anacona assembled all her chiefs and sub-chiefs to do him honor. Other Spaniards, notably Don Bartholomew Columbus, had visited her as Ovando came with an armed force and had been entertained without anything untoward happening to her people. So she held this to be but another instance of the kind. No, 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 no. And see, you can tell the American Indian's nature was not evil, okay? Of course, you had some evil, miserable people, but you can tell the nature wasn't evil. When you was dealing with these Europeans, the Anglo-Saxons, these Spaniards, and some possibly, probably, Northern Africans, Mohammedan Moors, when you dealing with these people, when you dealing with these men who used to take, and some of it is the remnants are happening today and have been happening since this time. As the Spanish army approached her village, troops of damsels met the soldiers with singing and dancing and the waving of palm leaves over their heads. These naked beauties, listen, man, this is horrible stuff, man. This is horrible stuff. These savage men, these savage men of Spain, they may have been smiling to these naked beauties who were waving palm leaves over their heads, but in their minds, they came to take over, okay? They moving everybody out the hood. This theirs now. Ain't nobody allowed to come up in this hood no more. These naked beauties were as innocent as they were graceful and pleasing, yet but a few days passed ere many of them were numbered with the hundreds of slain Indians that strewed the very ground they trod in rhythmic measure. After several days of feasting, during which the Spaniards enjoyed every dainty known to the Indians, after the Indians took care of them, and with the latter set before them with evident pleasure, the treacherous Ovando, who had been brooding constantly over his suspicions, gave the signal for a massacre. This might be how Thanksgiving really went. For the group of Indians that was possibly entertaining the pilgrims, the Anglos, the old peoples. The treacherous Ovando, who had been brooding constantly over his suspicions, gave the signal for a massacre. It had been preconcerted with his officers that he was to lay his hand upon a cross he wore on his breast, the cross of the high order of which he was a commander, that of Alcantara, for the bloodshed to begin. Comely Anacona and her lovely daughter had just entered the hut in which Ovando was lodged, accompanied by their train of female attendants, to proffer a request that he would order a joust of reeds to commence, in which the cavalry were to take part. So he strode forth, but instead of contributing his share to the entertainment his Indian friends had provided, he requited their hospitality with slaughter. At the signal, the cavalry charged with drawn swords and leveled lances upon the unsuspecting throng of naked Indians who had gathered in the square of the village to do honor to their murderers. The infantry let loose their crossbows and arquebuses, hacked with their halberds, and smote with their battle axes. And shortly there was no Indian left alive in the square, or at least no Indian whom the Spaniards intended should live. Even children and babes at their mothers' breasts were slashed with swords and impaled on pikes and lances. In one great house of the village were gathered 84 of Anacona's sub caciques, and these were all burned alive or caught and hanged to trees as they escaped from the flaming dwelling. Some of them were first put to the torture, and information elicited, upon which the fiendish Ovando proceeded against Anacona, whom he took to Santo Domingo and hanged in front of the church. The second in America, which the Spaniards had erected for the worship of the God they professed to serve. So the same God they profess to serve is the same God, that the people in these islands and in these parts of the Americas serve today. The same God that these demons serve. These things did Ovando, with whom in Hispaniola Juan Ponce de Leon served as a soldier, from whom he received the command that first brought him prominence and the impulse toward the career that placed him in the temple of fame. Juan Ponce de Leon, these things did Ovando, with whom in Hispaniola, the land of the so-called blacks, the land of the sun-kissed people. Can you imagine? Juan Ponce de Leon served as a soldier, from whom he received the command that first brought him prominence and the impulse toward the career that placed him in the temple of fame. Juan Ponce de Leon, you've seen the name on streets. There is a prominent street here where I am that is called Ponce de Leon. The street sign should be immediately taken down and never to be erected again. Cleveland Indians presented with mascot. Tris speaker with African American boy news service photo. Bidding has ended for this item. Thank you for visiting our past auction results. If you have an identical or similar to this auction item, please call or contact us to discuss. We look forward to speaking with you. Auction number 204 part 1, item 1310. Winning bid $153.06. There were 3 bids. Bidding ended Wednesday, November 9th, 2011 at 1 a.m. Item description. This is from www.hsn.com. Hakes.com. Item description: date stamped on reverse, NEA April 18th, 1925. Okay, 1925. And it says at the top, Cleveland Indians presented with mascot. With African American boy. Okay, so the mascot is an African American boy. And I shouldn't have to remind you there is no such thing as an African American, let alone an African American in 1925, right? Come on, man. Don't let them fool ya. 1925, African American, non-existent. Let's get into this. Date stamped on reverse, NEA April 18th, 1925. Cleveland presented with a mascot. Okay, Cleveland Indians presented with the mascot, meaning the mascot is going to represent the team, right? And is going to represent what the team is called, Cleveland Indians. Date stamped on reverse, NEA, April 18th, 1925. 8x10 glossy shows manager Trice Speaker in uniform on field with young African American boy. This is not an African American boy. This is 1925. Okay? No such thing as an African American. This is an American boy. An American Indian boy. That's why the Cleveland Indians are using him as a mascot, because he represents Indians. Standing next to him holding bow and arrow as crowd and stands look on. Paper caption on reverse includes text: opening of new 125,000 athletic field at Lakeland, Florida. Their training camp. Hamp posed with manager Trice Speaker after his presentation to the club. So shorty name is Hamp. Noting stamp from John L. Morris's Lakeland Chamber of Commerce. Photo has it handling creases, most just visible in reflected light, and small tear at the lower right side edge. Fine, outrageous concept by today's standards, from the Richard Merkin collection, and comes with Hakes, COA. So this is the picture of the Cleveland Indians' new mascot, Hamp, Shorty, the little American engine. Okay. Now this is written on the, this comes with the photo. I guess this has its authenticity, gives the authenticity of the photo. I think it's on the back. Cleveland Indians presented with mascot at opening of new $125,000 athletic field at Lakeland, Florida, their training camp. Hamp, Shorty, little American engine, Hamp, posed with manager Trice Speaker after his presentation to the club. Other dignitaries in attendance besides Hamp included. Other dignitaries in attendance besides Hamp. So Hamp is Shorty, the little American engine, the little. Besides Hamp, they're calling Hamp a dignitary, included Judge Kennesaw M. Landis, Commissioner of Baseball, and E.W. Sexton, President of the National Association of Baseball Clubs. The dedication was held March 17th. So Hamp, the little American engine boy, who they earlier called African American in 1925. And again, there is no such thing as an African American, period. Hamp, the little nigga, is considered a dignitary here, and he's the mascot of the Cleveland Indians, presented in Florida. And here is a picture of Trice, the manager, I guess, of the Cleveland Indians. And here is the mascot, the new mascot, Hamp. Yep, with a bow and arrow, representing Cleveland Indians. Okay. New Pittsburgh Courier newspaper, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Saturday, October 13th, 1951. Saturday, October 13th, 1951. Remember, Hamp was the Cleveland Indians mascot. They were presented with Hamp, who was considered a dignitary in 1925. This is 1961. New Pittsburgh Courier newspaper, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And earlier, we spoke on Juan Ponce de Leon, considered to be the founder of Florida. Famed. The great significance of Sewanee. New Pittsburgh Courier newspaper, Saturday, October 13th, 1951. The greater significance of Sewanee. More than 1,000 persons gathered at White Springs, Florida, on September 30th to honor the 100th anniversary of the publication of Stephen Foster's epic Swanee River, or The Old Folks at Home. The greater significance of the Suwannee River in our history was understandably passed over. For along its banks and those of the Apalachicola were founded the first independent Negro areas in the continental United States. There is no such thing as a Negro, or a black. So who are we speaking of? We are speaking of Americans, American Indians, those Injuns, those niggers that you know today. Okay? And we know Negro is, at this point, we know Negro is synonymous with American Indian. And some people might not like when I call them niggers. Well, I do. They were founded about 1732, the year George Washington was born, and thrived for almost, who we talking about? The greater significance of the Suwannee River, in our history was understandably passed over, for along its banks and those of the Apalachicola were founded the first independent Negro areas in the continental United States. They were founded about 1732, the year George Washington was born, and thrived for almost a century until destroyed by the slavocracy-controlled military power of the United States, the United Colonies, under General Jackson, later president, and others. The savagery continues. They were founded by runaway Negro slaves from the Carolina plantations who, passing through the southern Georgia regions, then part of the independent Creek Nation, they were founded by runaway Negro slaves from the Carolina plantations who, passing through the southern Georgia regions, then part of the independent Creek Nation, joined with certain detribalized Indians and entered northern Florida, then part of the Spanish Empire. Let me translate that for you. They were founded by niggers from Carolina who came through southern Georgia, where it was other niggers from southern Georgia. And along the way, they met other niggers. And when they got to northern Florida, that's where this all began. That's a translation right there. That's a translation. Okay? Let me go down here. Since Florida was too scarcely settled by the Spaniards to defend properly. So listen to this. You can't go nowhere. You can't go nowhere with these people there, with these Spaniards there. See, we just was talking about it. It said and entered northern Florida, then part of the Spanish Empire, right? You can't go nowhere without it being war. It reminds me of when these people speak of aliens and UFOs and all that garbage, all that garbage. And every time they speak about uh, unidentified flying objects or life forms from another planet and all this kind of stuff, the first thing that, like, even in the movies, the first thing that come to their mind is get ready for war. Like they want to fight. Is always let's fight. And you know why it's always let's fight? Because guess who gonna fight? Your children gonna fight. They ain't gonna fight. Your children gonna fight. Since Florida was too sparsely settled by the Spaniards to defend properly. So now, just because we going where we want to go in our soil, on our soil portion, on our homeland, just because our people going where they want to go, that means that these Spanish savages, now they have to defend something. They always seem scared. They always on they P's and Q's. They always scared. Since Florida was too sparsely settled by the Spaniards to defend properly, let alone develop, these Negro Indian refugees. Negro Indians. Now they Negro Indians. See how that work? I told you, once I did the translation, you should have believed me. Okay? You should have believed me. Because up here, it said were founded. It said passed over for along its banks, and those of the Apalachicola were founded the first independent Negro areas in the continental United States. Right? And then it said these were founded by runaway Negro slaves from the Carolina plantations who, passing through the southern Georgia regions, then part of the independent Creek Nation, joined with certain detribalized Indians and entered northern Florida, then part of the Spanish Empire. Now, let alone develop these Negro Indians or American Indians or Americans, the only Americans it ever was, is, and will be refugees, were encouraged and protected, even armed, uniformed, and organized into military companies under Negro officers or American Indian officers, first known as Maroons. No. Labeled as Maroons among other things, just like today. Some of you and some people allow people to label you anything. First known as Maroons, like their counterparts in Jamaica and elsewhere in the West Indies, they later became known as Seminoles, after the Indian word meaning refugees, or wild. The Indian word meaning refugees. That's what Seminoles, they saying Seminoles mean in Indian. After the Indian word. What Indian word? What Indians? Who they talking about? Which one of y'all families, in the way they spoke to one another, Seminoles meant refugees to your family members? Why they not telling us that? And the closer the slave plantations moved toward the Florida boundary, the greater the number of refugees reaching the Suwannee Apalachicola territory. See, they trying to make refugees, slaves, Americans, Negroes, Negro Indians, Seminoles, Maroons. They trying to make all these things synonymous. It worked. They use this word here, they use this word here, and they keep the confusion, they keep the lie alive. This free land populated by embittered ex-slaves and Negro Indians born in freedom became an intolerable menace to nearby colonial slaveholders. And on several occasions, expeditions of soldiers from this area raided as far north as Savannah and Charleston. The fiercely independent blacks, now they're blacks. Now your family members are black. See all the name? Listen, in these hundreds of articles, newspaper clippings, books, all these things that we've went over on this channel, in all these shows, one thing is consistent: the confusion. How they call you a bunch of different things. And listen, some people may be confused. You may be confused. I'm confused. You got to stay focused in order to get through this stuff, because they call you so many different things. Let's not answer to these things no more. Let's learn our people, learn what our people called themselves, and honor the name that our people called us. The fiercely independent blacks thrived unmolested during the War for Independence and the unsettled period afterward. But they were pro-British and anti-American, as shown by their aid to the English during the War of 1812, when the British built Blount's Fort in their area and turned it over to the Negro Indian warriors, or the American Indian warriors, or the Americans, with all of its arms and munitions when that war ended. They say that, let's go over it once more. It says unsettled period afterward, but they, talking about the blacks, were pro-British and anti-American. You see that? You see that wordplay? Anti-American. How could American Indians, Americans, the only Americans that ever was, is, and will be anti themselves? Because the foreigners, the settlers, the pilgrims, the Anglo-Saxons, the old peoples, they started their identity theft. They took your identity. They became you. With their pen, with their calligraphical, with their calligraphy pen, with their pen and their ink, with they found pen and they ink. They became you. Now they the American. And you a Negro Indian warrior. Or you a black. Or you a maroon. You maroon. You the color maroon. You a maroon. Or you a Seminole. Right? You ain't your name no more. Alarmed by this growing free military power below the boundary on which the slave plantations, always slave plantations, slave, 12 years slave, 12 slave roots. It's always slave. Now impinged, thanks to the ousting of the Creeks, General Jackson was ordered to attack the Spanish province in 1818. Damn, in 1818, I know what my people was. I know where a lot of my peoples of different bloodlines was. I know where they was in 1818. And this stuff is happening. It just lets you know that just like things are happening today, many things happening today, and it's not really affecting you physically. It's the same thing, because this soil portion we live on, this so-called land we live on is vast. So things happen over there and they don't affect what's happening over here physically, I mean. General Jackson was ordered to attack the Spanish province in 1880, and General Jackson didn't attack nobody. The soldiers attacked somebody, okay? These people, the same as today, these people, they ain't on the front lines. These people ain't doing nothing. They can send your children out to do their dirty work. General Jackson was ordered to attack the Spanish province in 1818 with 5,000 Tennessee volunteers and some regular army troops. Greatly outnumbered the American Indians, it says the Negro Indian troops nevertheless fought two great pitched battles, but when a lucky shot from a U.S. gunboat exploded the magazine at Blount's Fort, killing and wounding all of the men and women occupants, the Seminoles had to retire to the swamps. Many of those captured by the savage Tennessee whites were scalped. Many of those captured by the savage Tennessee whites were scalped. Weakened by the Napoleonic Wars and threatened by the growing U.S. power, Spain was compelled to abandon her Negro Indian allies or her American Indian allies and sell the Florida colony to the United States, i.e., to the slave-holding enemies of these free people. Hunted down with soldiers and fierce dogs. Here we go with the dogs again, man. Here we go with they dogs. And them is some fierce dogs, man. No joke. And these not the big old lap dogs that you might have. You might even have them and you know of today. These was dogs that they wouldn't feed for a little while. These was dogs that they fed people to. Hunted down with soldiers and fierce dogs, some of these people were returned or sold to Georgia slaveholders. Others were sent on the long journey to the Oklahoma reservations, and the remainder retired to the swampy lands around Lake Okeechobee, where they live today. So when you hear or sing Swanee River, do not think merely of Stephen Foster, who knew nothing about it, but of the brave black pioneers and their Indian friends and relatives who did. Do not think merely of Stephen Foster, who knew nothing about it, but of the brave American Indians who did. How black Seminoles found freedom from enslavement in Florida. No such thing as a black human. And we know that Seminoles is a name that it seems that were given to people. I'm not sure what them people called themselves. They said the Indian word for refugees was Seminole. Some say the Spanish. It was Spanish. Who cares? It would help if we had some names of some humans, some names of some people. But here we have a picture of what they term as black Seminoles. A picture of 5 sisters right here. How black Seminoles found freedom from enslavement in Florida. By K. Chris Hurst, November 18th, 2020. Black Seminoles were formed by escaped enslaved people during the Seminole tribe in Florida for freedom. Let's go over it. Black Seminoles, escaped enslaved people joining the Seminole tribe. Black Seminoles were enslaved Africans and Black Americans who, beginning in the late 17th century, fled plantations in the Southern American colonies and joined with the newly formed Seminole tribe in Spanish-owned Florida. From the late 1690s until Florida became a U.S. territory in 1821, thousands of indigenous people and freedom seekers fled areas of what is now the southeastern United States to relatively open promise of the Florida Peninsula. It's so many misnomers here. It's hard to go over. It's just so much. It's so much fugazi in this. It's so much flim flam in this. First of all, black, no such thing. Seminoles is a label that was given to some people. Enslaved Africans. What does that have to do with anything we're speaking of? And Black Americans, no such thing as a black, who beginning in the late 17th century, the late 1600s, fled plantations in the Southern American colonies and joined with the newly formed Seminole tribe in Spanish-owned Florida. From the late 1690s until Florida became a U.S. territory in 1821, thousands of now indigenous people and freedom seekers fled areas of what is now southeastern United States to relatively open promise of the Florida Peninsula. I'm not going to think for you. Read this again, what's on the screen. Look at what I've underlined. Think about what we went over so far. And then see if it makes sense to you. Seminoles and Black Seminoles. Here we go. This is to keep the lie alive, because we haven't, up to this point, we haven't heard anything about an African, okay? African people who escaped enslavement were called Maroons. Now, a little earlier, it wasn't African people who escaped enslavement were called Maroons. We gotta go back up. We gotta go back up. If we can go, if it's still here, yeah, okay. Let's go back. We need to go to Maroons. Here we go. Here we go. Even armed, uniformed, and organized into military companies under Negro officers. Okay, listen. Let alone develop these Negro Indian, American Indian refugees were encouraged and protected, even armed, uniformed, and organized into military companies under Negro officers, first known as Maroons like their counterparts in Jamaica and elsewhere in the West Indies. They later became known as Seminoles. Okay? These were Negro Indians, American Indians, Negro officers, first known as Maroons. Now let's go back. Let's get back on track, man. African people who escaped enslavement were called Maroons. This is a lie, man. Listen, man. Hold on. Let's go back up. And get this name. K. Chris Hurst, you lying. Period. That's the fun thing about going through these articles. These are readily available articles that a lot of people read. And they stand alone. They not put with anything else in order to paint a picture. African people who escaped enslavement were called Maroons in the American colonies, a word derived from Spanish word cimarron, meaning runaway or wild one. I thought that was what Seminole was. The Maroons who arrived in Florida and settled with the Seminoles. I thought the Spanish word cimarron, meaning runaway or wild one, is the same thing they say is the Spanish word for Seminole. It's cimarron, meaning runaway or wild one. It's the exact same definition of Seminole. It says the Spanish word cimarron, meaning runaway or wild one, is what a Seminole is said to be. The Maroons who arrived in Florida and settled with the Seminoles. So they're saying Maroons and Seminoles are two different things. Right here, they're saying that the Maroons are African people who escaped enslavement. But above, in the newspaper clipping, we could see that American Indians were the ones who were called Maroons. So what is it? I think this person just don't got it together. They need to get it together, right? No, they don't. We gonna get it together. We gonna get into this. Let's shake it. The Maroons who arrived in Florida and settled with the Seminoles were called a variety of names, including Black Seminoles, Seminole Maroons, and Seminole Freedmen. The Seminoles gave them the tribal name of, so now these people who was given a label of Seminoles, who we don't know who these people are. I believe at one time they were saying that these people was a bunch of different peoples, a bunch of different Americans, but Americans, no doubt, gave them the tribal name of Estelusti, a Muskogee word. So Muskogee word for black. So they just gonna call some people black who the same complexion they is. The word Seminole is also a corruption of the Spanish word cimarron. The Spanish themselves use cimarron to refer to indigenous refugees in Florida. Right? Okay, now we get into indigenous. Now we get into the truth. Indigenous people, Americans, who were deliberately avoiding Spanish contact. Seminoles in Florida were a new tribe, made up mostly of Muskogee or Creek people, fleeing the decimation of their own groups by European brought violence and disease. In 1693, a royal Spanish decree promised freedom and sanctuary to all enslaved persons who reached Florida if they were willing to adopt Catholic religion. Supposedly the first Africans, about 20 and odd Africans, arrived, and now they fleeing and flooding Florida. Yes. Enslaved Africans fleeing Carolina and Georgia flooded in. Listen, 1693. So-called the first 20 and odd Africans came to Virginia. This started the whole idea of our beginnings here in America. Our beginnings in America. In 1619, right? Then in 1693, enslaved Africans fleeing Carolina and Georgia knew their way. They knew their way. They knew their direction. They knew where they was going. And Carolina and Georgia flooded in. The Spanish granted plots of land to the refugees north of St. Augustine. So the Spanish started giving these people land who came here from Virginia, from, let's see where they was coming from, from Carolina. They came here from Carolina and they knew their way. And when they got to Florida, the Spanish, the savage brutes, the savage brutes with the Spanish mastiffs eating people alive, they granted plots of land to the refugees north of St. Augustine, where the Maroons established the first legally sanctioned free black community in North America called Fort Mose, or Gracia Rio de Santa Teresa de Mose. De Mose. So they started the first black community and called it a Spanish name. Okay. And they calling them Maroons. They calling the enslaved Africans who knew their way through the Carolinas, and mind you, these is woods. They going through woods. They going through the woods, fleeing Carolina, going to Georgia, then going to Florida. They knew their way. When they got there, the savages, the savage Spaniards, gave them plots of land, and they started their own community, and they called it some Spanish. During the 18th century, a large number of Maroons in Florida had been born and raised in the tropical regions of Congo, Angola, in Africa. During the 18th century, 1700s, a large amount of these so-called Maroons, so-called escaped enslaved Africans, wherever they was previous, they not talking about the ones that came. They not talking about these in the previous paragraphs, the ones who fled Carolina and Georgia and made their way to Florida, and they was given plots of land. They not talking about them. They talking about Samoa. They talking about Samoa, because we was just talking about the 1600s, 1693. We was talking about the 1600s, early 1700s. Then during the 1700s, a large number of Maroons in Florida had been born and raised in the tropical regions of Congo, Angola. What's the time frame here, man? They need to give us some dates, because they moving real fast. Been born, they've been born and raised in tropical regions of Congo, Angola, in Africa. They was born there, became adults or teenagers and all that. And now they in Florida. Many of the incoming enslaved Africans did not trust the Spanish, and so they allied with the Seminoles. According to who? First, they need to give us some sources. According to who? And give us some timelines. Give us some dates. At least give us the years. The Seminoles were an aggregate of linguistically and culturally diverse indigenous nations. What? Of indigenous nations from America? You just said all these Africans were with the Seminoles now. The Seminoles were an aggregate of linguistically and culturally diverse indigenous nations, and they included a large contingent of the former members of the Muskogee polity, also known as the Creek Confederacy. These were refugees, again, more refugees from Alabama and Georgia, who had separated from the Muskogee in part as a result of internal disputes. What internal disputes? They had an argument. They was arguing. Oh, man. So they was arguing, and they were separated from their people. And they went to Florida. They were refugees from Alabama and Georgia. How many people had arguments? How many people was arguing and left because they was arguing? They moved to Florida, where they absorbed members of other groups already there, and the new collective name and the new collective named themselves Seminoles. So they all came together and called themselves Seminoles. In some respects, incorporating African refugees now. Now they're African refugees and not enslaved Africans, runaway slave Africans. They're refugees into, what are we talking about here? Into the Seminole Band would have been simply adding in another tribe. The new Estelusti tribe had many useful attributes. Many of the Africans had guerrilla warfare experience. They had guerrilla warfare experience. They was kidnapped, taken from their homeland. 3-month journey across an ocean. It is said. 3-month journey across an ocean, packed like sardines. All manner of craziness on the sardine boat. And they still had guerrilla warfare experience. Where was that experience when they were being captured? Before they got on the boat, before they had to march from Angola to whatever slave port they was being picked up at. Where was the guerrilla warfare why wasn't guerrilla warfare happening then? Many of the Africans had guerrilla warfare experience, were able to speak several European languages. How? Well, are we talking about the same people? We talking about African refugees, okay? Were these people, when you say refugees, were these people voluntarily leaving, quote, Africa, end quote? Like how you see people on the news today, getting on rafts, going across, going a few miles across the water to Spain and whatnot. Or are these people on some kind of airplane coming here as refugees to work? Did they catch the bus to come here and work? They money wasn't right. They wanted to go make some money. They fell on hard times, so they came over here to work. Because it say they able to speak several European languages and knew about tropical agricultures. Maybe I'm missing something. That mutual interest, Seminole fighting to keep a purchase in Florida and Africans fighting to keep their freedom, created a new identity for the Africans as Black Seminoles. Is that what it did? And is that who the Black Seminoles are? So they saying, yo people from Florida are Africans who call themselves Black Seminoles. Other Black Seminole groups were re-enslaved by the Seminole. Some reports say that for formerly enslaved people, bondage to the Seminole was far less harsh than that of enslavement under Europeans. See how they do that? It say they were re-enslaved by the Seminole. Then it goes to tell you how bondage under their own people was far less harsh than enslavement under the European. And they quickly said that after they said they were re-enslaved by the Seminole, in order to make you think any of this is for real, that any of this is reality. All this is fake. Okay? They try to put one thing and then they put something else. They put one thing that sounds kind of, Seminole, some were re-enslaved by the Seminole. Okay. And some reports say that formerly enslaved people, bondage to the Seminole was far less harsh than that of the Europeans. So you thinking, oh, okay, it was far less harsh, I'm pretty sure, because it was their own people. But no, that whole thing is to make you think that any of this is the truth. None of it's the truth. Use it for toilet paper. Black Seminoles may have been referred to as slaves by the other Seminoles, but their bondage was closer to tenant farming. They were required to pay a portion of their harvest to the Seminole leaders, but enjoyed substantial autonomy in their own separate communities. The opportunity for Seminoles, black or otherwise, to stay in Florida disappeared after the U.S. took possession of the peninsula in 1821. A series of clashes between the Seminoles and the U.S. government, the Seminole Wars. This was an explicit attempt to force Seminoles and their black allies out of the state and clear it for white colonization. The black Seminoles had an uncertain status in the greater Seminole tribe. Here we go. Here we go with the here we go with the here we go with the current the lie that continues to this day. The black Seminoles had an uncertain status in greater Seminole tribe in part because of their ethnicity and the fact that they had been enslaved people. Okay? The black Seminole had an uncertain status in the greater Seminole tribe in part because of their ethnicity and the fact that they had been enslaved people. They're trying to make you believe that the black Seminole is different from the Seminole. If you believe that, this is going to make sense to you. The one drop rule stated that if one had any African blood at all, they were African and therefore less entitled to the same rights and freedoms as whites in the United States, in the new United States. 18th century African, 1700s, 18th century African, indigenous, and Spanish communities did not use the same one-drop rule to identify black people. In the early days of the European settlement of the Americas, neither Africans or indigenous people fostered such ideological beliefs or created regulatory practices. In the early days of the European settlements of the Americas, in the early days of the European settlements, the 13 colonies or less than the 13 colonies, the European settlements, how many ever there were, of the Americas along the eastern seaboard, neither Africans, what Africans, how many, where are they coming from, nor indigenous people fostered such ideological beliefs or created regulatory practices. As the United States grew and prospered, a string of public policies and even scientific studies, science, that which is your God, some people's God. Everything has to come back to science. What does science say? The science say that if I slob on this Q-tip and send it off into the ether, a certificate will come back from a scientist. Scientific studies work to erase the black Seminoles from the national consciousness and official histories. In 1990, the U.S. Congress finally passed the Distribution Act detailing the use of the Judgment Fund. The next year, the usage plan passed by the Seminole Nation. Excluded the black Seminoles again from participation. How could the Seminoles exclude the black Seminoles when the Seminole and the black Seminole are the same thing? In 1990, they were not the same thing. In 1990, one was made up of, one became a business, one became a corporation, one became a company. In 2000, the Seminoles expelled the black Seminoles from their group entirely. On paper, a court case. Who was the Seminoles expelling the black Seminoles? Let's start with the chief. Let's start with the Seminoles chief. Let's go look and see who the Seminole chief is. A court case was opened, Davis versus U.S. government, by Seminoles who were either black Seminole or of both African and Seminole heritage. Wait, I thought enslaved Africans was considered Seminoles. Now it's black Seminole that is both it's okay, by Seminoles who were either black Seminole or of both African and Seminole heritage. They argued that their exclusion from the judgment constituted racial discrimination. That suit was brought against the U.S. Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Seminole Nation, as a sovereign nation, could not be joined as a defendant. The case failed in U.S. District Court because the Seminole Nation was not part of the case. In 2003, see the new Seminole, this separating the black Seminole and the Seminole, as we've went over, it makes perfect sense because what they're terming as the Seminole and the black Seminole, what they're terming as the Seminole, is almost like the Easter Bunny or the Tooth Fairy, at this point. In 2003, the Bureau of Indian Affairs issued a memorandum welcoming black Seminoles back into the larger group. Attempts to patch the broken bonds that had existed between black Seminoles and the rest of the Seminole population has seen varied success. A complete guide for Florida dreads. Everything you need to know about Florida dreads. This is 2022. Florida dreads, also known as WICK's hairstyle. This is dreadextensions.com. The famous Florida wicks originated from South Florida. Picture of the Florida wicks. And this picture is from Atlanta, Georgia. Another picture right there from Orlando, Florida. Florida wicks, everything you need to know about this Floridian hairstyle, this American hairstyle, American Indian hairstyle. This is 2023. The Florida wick. You can see. Get a better picture of the Florida wicks. It is also called globs or bunks. Is it? If anybody's watching the show right now, let me know if you're from Florida, if you're a Florida Indian, let me know if they also call globs or bunks. You know if that's correct. This unique hairstyle is believed to have originated from South Florida. It is common amongst African Americans. No such thing as an African American. So who they talking about? They talking about you, the American Indian, or the American. The only American it ever was, is, and will be. Some folks have likened the growing of wicks to trees that grow from the roots of the hair to the tip. Do the right thing.